Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
I think something that served me really well coming up is that I never expected playwriting to make me any money. And so when it started making me any money at all, it felt like a gift.
Coming up, he's still early in his career, but playwright and Idaho native Samuel Hunter has a darn good draft of his life so far. His latest honor, the MacArthur Fellowship, known by many as the Genius Grant. I talk with Hunter about what it's been like to win the award and why so many of his plays are set in Idaho. That's Dialogue next. Stay tuned. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. Some people know early on what they want to do in life. Such is the case with my guest today. Samuel Hunter has been writing plays since he was in high school in Moscow, Idaho. Hunter went on to graduate from New York University, the University of Iowa, and the Juilliard Playwrights Program. In 2011, when he was only 29, he won an Obie Award, considered Off-Broadway's highest honor, for his play, A Bright New Boise. The following year, I talked with Hunter about his success and the themes of his works. Well, it wasn't long before he was recognized again. In 2014, Hunter was one of 21 people chosen for a MacArthur Fellowship, dubbed the Genius Grant. With the honor, he'll receive $625,000 over 5 years. In the spring of 2015, Hunter returned to his home state to speak to the Idaho Community Foundation and to give the commencement address at the University of Idaho. He stopped by the Dialogue studio again, and of course I wanted to know what the experience of winning the MacArthur has been like. Well, first, congratulations. Really, really special for you to get the MacArthur Fellowship. Tell me where you were when that happened and how it happened.
It was a very crazy moment. I was just at home. I was actually, I was in rehearsal in Chicago for a play called Rest, but
By the way, one of my favorites.
Oh, thank you so much, yeah. But I had taken just a few days off in the middle of the rehearsal period to come home. And so I was at home and...
in New York?
In New York, writing on my computer. And, well, my phone rang and it was a Chicago number, and so I thought it was somebody at the theater, like, bugging me for, like, a blog post that I hadn't given them or something like that, and so I didn't answer it the first time. But then about 5 minutes later, they called again, and so I answered, and it was this woman who said, "Are you somewhere where you can speak confidentially?" Which totally freaked me out. I thought that something had gone terribly wrong in Chicago. I thought somebody I knew had been murdered, I witnessed a crime or something. But then she told me that she was calling from the MacArthur Foundation and that I'd been awarded the MacArthur Fellowship. And I mean, it was crazy because, you know, you don't apply for it, you don't know you're being considered. You know, I had no idea that this had been in the works for a year, maybe even more. So it was mind-blowing. It's still really surprising to me, and it you know, several months later, it still hasn't totally settled in.
And you're not allowed to tell anybody, right? Or you can tell one person.
You can tell one person for 2 seriously strange weeks. Just like it's almost like somebody is like, they come to you and they're like, "Here's a unicorn, but don't tell anybody you have a unicorn." And so you're walking around thinking, "I have a unicorn," and it becomes so surreal so quickly. You know, I mean, I couldn't tell my parents. I told my husband. He was the only person on earth I told. And
his reaction was?
I like sat him down before it happened. We were in Central Park. I met him after work, and I told him, and he had the same reaction I did. Because when I first heard it, I was like, well, surely this is not the MacArthur Fellowship I'm thinking of.
The Genius
Grant. And they don't call it the Genius Grant.
I know,
so on the phone call, they didn't say that. And so when I told him, I think he asked me at least 3 times, like, "Are you sure? Like, did they say the number to you?" So yeah.
You mean the total number of dollars?
Yeah, of dollars.
Yeah. Which would, tip you off that it was the Genius Grant. So how does it feel being a genius now?
It's funny, that word is like, it's like a beautiful punch in the stomach. It's like, it's wonderful, but it's also like, oof, like, because I think this is why the foundation probably discourages use of the word, because it's like, I mean, the word genius is like nearly meaningless in and of itself. So I mean, they give it for these ideas about creativity. So, but it feels great. I mean, it's great. It feels like a very big validation, but also too, it's a mandate to do better work, and I think I take that very seriously. It's not about resting on your laurels, and because I'm still, this is a grant about future potential, and I'm still growing as a writer. I'm still hopefully becoming a better writer, play by play. So yeah, it's about that promise for future work.
So what does this afford you, Sam? What does it mean? You can just focus on the work for a couple of years. It's over a period of 5 years after the federal and state governments take their cut of it.
Right.
It's not like it's a huge sum of money, but it's enough to focus in. Is that what it'll do for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's like a nice salary, for 5 years, and I think the greatest gift that it's given me so far is the beautiful ability to say no. I mean, because when you're coming up and as an emerging artist, especially, I think you say yes to everything. Whether or not it's the best opportunity or not, because you're just so hungry for work and just trying to get everything out there. And so for a long time, it just felt, anathema to say no to anything. And recently, I've really realized that I can give myself the gift of slowing down a little bit, that I don't have to spend 250 days out of the year traveling to various theaters and stuff. So yeah, it's that kind of beautiful gift of being able to slow down and not having to push myself for quantity, and I can focus more on quality, I
So
guess.
what will you focus on? You said you feel this pressure, maybe isn't the right word, but responsibility to keep growing, keep learning. What do you think you'll spend the time doing?
Boy, I mean, it's such a great question. I think that more than anything, it's made me ask myself some really big questions about what it is that I'm doing and ways that I can push myself. Because for the last several years, I've been writing these, quiet, small plays set in Idaho, and that's still what I'm really interested in. But I'm interested in sort of like, okay, what are some different directions that I can go in artistically? I mean, like, I have these two plays, Lewiston and Clarkston, that are sort of companion pieces, and that's the first time I've done anything like that. And for me, that's very ambitious to write two plays that are interconnected, that are in conversation with one another. So I guess I mean the broader thing that I've been thinking about is like, what is my body of work, rather than just like, what's the next play? What is the larger project that I'm making here? What's this map of Idaho that I'm drawing play by play?
Sure. Well, let's talk about Lewiston Clarkston. Yeah. Those are the two plays that I saw most recently in readings, so they're not fully developed quite yet. Really enjoyed them. The concept is fascinating, to take descendants of both Meriwether Lewis and Clark and kind of show what their lives are like now, as mundane as they are.
Right.
Where did the idea to do this come from?
Well, the genesis was actually really simple. I was with my husband John, and we were driving, I forget what this was, I think maybe it was a couple Christmases ago, and we were driving through Lewiston and Clarkston, and John made a joke, and he said, you should write a play called Lewiston and a play called Clarkston. And immediately I just thought that was a great idea. He didn't mean it seriously at all. But there's just something about it, because in pretty much every play I've ever written, the tension in the play, or a lot of the dramatic tension, comes from characters who are trying to reconcile the divine with the banal, or the sort of greater existential questions of their life and the fact that they work at a Hobby Lobby. And so there's something about the vastness of the Lewis and Clark story and the sort of legend of it, and how that relates to the West and opening it up, that it's so large. And I thought, if I could take those ideas and then contain them with, like Clarkston is set at the Costco in Clarkston, so it's like the antithesis of that romantic idea of trekking west, and
although there's a character in there who is trying to make that trek and
exactly
realizing it's maybe not as romantic as you thought it would be. Yeah.
So that tension just immediately was so interesting and lush to me, and then just and I think that in a certain way, the plays don't depend on one another in terms of story or character, so they're independent plays. You could do them independently, But I'm really interested in Lewiston being more about the past and Clarkston being more about the future. And I guess that's how they ultimately
Well,
work
and the
together.
idea in Lewiston of this woman who's descended from Lewis and has this plot of land and she's selling it off piece by piece, probably very realistic. I mean, in the end, that is happening, and kind of the paving over
Right.
of these areas that were originally pioneer areas.
Yeah.
Certainly up here, you know, the pieces of the Oregon Trail are still around, but a lot of it's paved over for
Yeah.
subdivisions. So I just thought it was very interesting. Now, I know the last time we talked in 2012, you told me that Idaho, the settings for your plays are almost always in Idaho, one in Montana. But for all intents and
And one in
purposes,
Clarkston, Washington.
yeah, one now in Clarkston, Washington. But you told me that the having Idaho in the plays was purely incidental, that it kind of gave you a relief of having to concentrate or learn about another setting so you could concentrate on the story. But it seems to me that in Lewiston and in Clarkston, the setting itself is very important. It's integral to the story. So is there a shift now where Idaho is not just incidental to the story, but part of the story?
I think it's definitely shifted, and honestly, you know, if you talk to me 3 years from now, it might shift again.
Sure.
You know, but I think that back then, the plays were trying to be about something broader about America, and I thought Idaho was such a great container for that, because you know, when you do a play that's set in Idaho and you perform it in New York City, people have very little context, you know, for what it means to be in Idaho, and so it's a great kind of blank slate to talk about America. But I think it's shifted a little bit recently, because you know, there's a reason that I'm continually drawn to Idaho specifically, and I actually a few years ago I wrote a first draft of a play, and for the first time I thought, well, let's make the setting a blank slate, and I didn't say Idaho. It was just sort of an unnamed
It was
suburb.
set in
It was just it was set in I think it was in a
Mid-America
Walmart.
or something? I
Well,
know
it
you
wasn't.
had
This
one
actually
that-
wasn't
okay.
a play I sent you. It was
All right.
it was a play that was set in a Walmart food court, and I just wanted it to be any Walmart
Right.
food court anywhere in America. And the play didn't ultimately work for a lot of reasons. But I thought, but that play, which I eventually just scrapped entirely, I kind of plundered it for parts. But that play really taught me that, like, oh, there actually is something specific that I'm getting at in Idaho, and in my relationship to Idaho and my past in Idaho, and I shouldn't be scared of that or suddenly become unspecific about it. So yeah, I think it's changing again, you know, but who knows, in 5 years I might be writing plays set on the moon. I have no idea.
Well, your family does go back many generations, 6?
6 in Moscow, yeah, back to a Civil War veteran named Robert Barton, who was Latah County's first sheriff and built the Moscow Hotel, which still is downtown.
And your folks are still
Still there, yeah.
there. Your
Yeah.
dad is a doctor.
My dad's an emergency room physician, but he actually works in Lewiston at St. Joseph's.
So you heard, well, you grew up in Idaho, and you heard a lot of stories from your dad as well that helped populate your mind for some of the characters you have.
Definitely, yeah. Yeah, no, I think, you know, you see, I think when you work in an emergency room, you see sort of bare naked humanity,
Yeah,
you know.
literally.
And yeah. I mean, it's people at their most vulnerable,
Yeah.
at their most desperate, and
When your characters are.
yeah, and that's always been what I've been drawn to, are those kind of people. People who are just like on the fringes of acceptability in these smaller towns, or these people who are just can't find a way to negotiate their own existential doubt and are having
Right.
just trouble putting one foot in front of the other. In a certain way, you know, it does come from people like Matt and stories I've heard, but a lot of that is just personal to me, that, you know, that I think in a way the plays are my personal, and not to get too psychologizing about it, but the plays are my personal mechanism by which I can put one foot in front of the other, or like I can put my metaphysical and existential doubt into a piece of theater and share it, and converse about it, so I can move forward in my own life.
And we've talked about this before in the other program, and I encourage people to look at that on our website. You're gay. You grew up understanding that at a certain point, and as you say, negotiating that knowledge with the fact that you were in a pretty religious school at the time. Gay people are almost always in your plays. I think I went through the ones that I had read, and with the exception of maybe one,
Yeah.
they're in the plays. And you've talked before about how, again, just like the setting of Idaho was incidental, that you're not trying to make a statement about gay life in America, that this is part of a person.
Yeah.
But by the same token, you keep putting gay characters in your plays. So
Yeah.
I'm wondering if, as with Idaho,
Yeah.
there's more to that you're trying to say or trying to express to the audience.
I think that the for a long time when I was coming up as a student of playwriting, I didn't write any gay characters for a number of years, and I think that it was a way of me. It was a defense mechanism, and it was a way of me not getting too personal, not getting too touchy, with my own feelings, and but it wasn't until like I finally just sort of said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I have to write something personal. I have to write something that's really working something out for me, because how can I ask an audience to be emotionally invested in something when I'm not emotionally invested in it? And so I think that process was me putting myself on the line in my plays and becoming much more emotionally vulnerable. I think, and when I was writing earlier on, the plays were quite experimental, actually.
Almost absurdist, some
Yeah,
of them.
yeah.
Which I enjoy, by the way.
Right, yeah.
Like-
No, and I still have a soft place in my
Yeah.
heart for them. And even go further back, they become very experimental and very absurdist. Like what I was writing when I was a freshman and a sophomore in college. They lacked all semblance of story and character. I mean, they were kind of tone poems of plays. So I think that I realize it's that process of organically finding the artist who you truly are. And sometimes it's very different from the person you thought you were going to be. I'm a very different writer from the sort of like experimental downtown theater artist that I was back in, 2001, 2002 when I was first writing plays.
Were you inspired by Foreman? Is that
Yeah,
right?
Richard Foreman. I interned at
Yeah.
his theater, the Wooster Group, and I still love all that downtown theater. I adore it.
I mean, his goal is to make the audience quite uncomfortable sometimes.
Yeah, and
right?
alienate them.
Yeah.
It's very alienating.
Yeah.
And I think what I realized about what I have to offer it's the opposite of alienating, is that the only way by which I can make a play of any value is to make it as open-hearted and empathetic as it possibly can be.
Well, and it is, because that's what I get out of all your plays, is even if you have a character that's when you're reading it or watching it, you go, oh, I don't really like this person that much.
Right.
By the end, you understand them a lot better, at least I do, and you have
Right.
an empathy for them. And I think that comes through quite clearly in your work, is that empathetic voice that you have. Do you think you will be doing plays that have no gay characters in them eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I've written one or two. I've always been, in fact, I'm working on one right now, and I actually don't think there is a gay character in it. But yeah, it's not. I don't feel that it's a mandate for me to write gay characters. I think that it's just the way that I can get into a play and make it more personal, make it more specific. Because ultimately I'm writing from my own experience, as we all do. We cobble together our own experience, stories we've heard, things we've seen, and we try to construct them into a meaningful story that can make meaning of the meaningfulness that surrounds us. So yeah, I'm not sure where that's going to take me in the future.
Now, as we talk, you've just finished about a week-long, 1,500-mile trip through Idaho, seeing places you've never seen before. Will that help you think, with your plays as they continue to be set in Idaho? What were you looking for on that trip? Was it about dialogue? Was it about scenes?
It was very intangible, what I was trying to do with this 1,500-mile drive. And I have to, I started in Moscow, went all the way up to Bonners Ferry, and then went all the way down through southeastern Idaho and back. And I think, when I first started and I was driving up to Wallace and I was in like hour one, I said to myself, like, what am I doing? What is this weird project that I've been embarking upon? And because it wasn't really about because I've never been the kind of writer who I meet someone, I'm like, I'm putting that character in a play. I've just never been that kind of writer. And so it wasn't like I was looking for characters or looking for stories. I think, was more about like reacquainting myself with a landscape that I keep finding myself returning to. And I think part of it too is a little while ago I realized it's been a year and a half since I've been back to Idaho, which is a long time for me. I used to religiously come back twice a year. So it was really just this part of me that just said, I just want to see parts of the state I haven't seen before. And so I avoided interstates as much as possible and took small little highways, and went through fascinating little towns and took pictures and wrote. I didn't write any dialogue, but I just wrote about things that I saw and things that I was felt. Yeah, and how that related to my own experience and things that I remembered, driving up north and remembering something that happened to me when I was 9 years old that I haven't thought about in 24 years.
Your dialogue, for me, is great. Of course, your plays are focused on dialogue. Mm-hmm. Do you listen to people's conversations in cafes and things like that? Now, you may not put that dialogue in, but for the cadence, for the words, are you conscious of that, or is that just coming from inside of you, your dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain degree. Sometimes I'll I had relatives who spoke with such a cadence that was just so interesting, like my grandmothers and grandfathers, and so some of that I incorporate into it. But a lot of it I found is that I really have to have an inside-out approach to character, and so I need to let the character themselves sort of dictate how they speak, because it's very idiosyncratic between everyone. The words they use, how long their sentences are.
So do you hear them when you're writing? Do you hear?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's like as I realize who they are as people, I think that starts to dictate how they speak. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. Now, some of your themes are quite, I don't know, what word should we use? Edgy, somebody might say, but realistic, another person would say, because it's about life. But say, for instance, assisted suicide, mm-hmm. or suicide, that comes up in your plays. Well, talk first of all about that theme of suicide and why it's prevalent.
Suicide, I think, it has appeared frequently in my plays, and I'm always constantly surprised how frequently it appears, because again, I don't sit down thinking like, okay, what's the sort of basket of ideas that I normally return to, and let's pull one out again. Like it was not until recently that a very close friend of mine, a director I work with very extensively, named Davis McCallum, pointed that out, that the majority of my plays have some element of suicide in them. And so it got me thinking about it, and I think what it might be is that if the plays are concerned with this sort of existential question of what am I doing here, why am I on this earth, and how do I move forward in this imperfect vessel, then suicide is kind of the bleakest possible response to that question. And so I think that, most of these plays end in notes of hopefulness and forward movement. They're sort of like the ray of light shining in the darkness, sometimes not until the last seconds of the play.
Yes.
And so if I'm going to get to that, I feel like if I'm going to get to the optimism, if I can use that word, then I have to examine the other end of it. That is it better to just delete oneself from the equation entirely? I mean, there's this one of the plays I sent you, 5 Genocides. I mean, the center of that play is a man who comes to the conclusion that the most ethical thing he can do for society is to take himself out of it, and that's I think that's an essential darkness that needs to be in the plays if they're going to get toward the hope.
Does it mean that some of your plays won't be produced as much as others because they
absolutely.
Community is just not going to, I mean, A Permanent Image, which is also about assisted suicide, it's about a lot of things, but it has assisted suicide in it, was performed here. I understand it will now be performed someplace else, but it's been kind of it's been quiescent, right? I mean, it hasn't gotten a lot of performances. Is that because it's?
I think so. I think it's probably for, you never know when a play is going to catch on, and it always surprises. The fact that The Whale is my most produced play continues to baffle me. I mean, I think it's great, but I remember writing that play and thinking nobody was going to produce a play about a 600-pound shut-in who's dying. But I think with Permanent Image, I think the difficult thing for people is that they do it in the end. They go through with the assisted suicide. Whereas the sort of maybe more digestible narrative would be if they're convinced not to.
Right. We have another play, well, we won't give it away, but there's another play in which the person doesn't go through it and it might get performed more. But it still doesn't seem to matter to you what, you're going to write what you're going to write, regardless of whether it's going to be seen by a lot of people, because it's something about getting that out.
Yeah. I think it always has to start. Anything I've ever written of value, I think, just starts from a very personal place, and I think that's probably also why I've written a lot of plays, because you just never know which one is going to catch on, and a lot of them are just a little hard. They're difficult plays.
For anyone out there watching, particularly a young person who's thinking, I want to do this, but I'm not going to get a job from it, or so I've been told. What would you tell them about keeping going?
I think that the job thing is really tough. Thinking of playwriting like a job is very complicated. I think something that served me really well coming up is that I never expected playwriting to make me any money. And so when it started making me any money at all, it felt like a gift. And I still think of it that way. And I think if you start expecting something as strange and unwieldy as playwriting to be giving you $50,000 or even $20,000 a year in health insurance, it's most likely not going to do that. The vast majority of the time, it's not going to do that. It took me well over a decade to be able to consider giving up any of my day jobs. So I think if you go into it for a simple love of the craft itself, then you're fine. But if you go into it expecting it to immediately be monetized and to become your economy, you're going to come to resent it really, really quickly.
Do you have a sense of what's next for you?
Actually, more than any other time in my life, I don't, and it feels amazing because, like I said before, when I didn't have the MacArthur, I was saying yes to everything because I really just felt like I needed to have at least 6 months ahead of me so I knew where rent, now mortgage, was coming from. But now that pressure has been taken away, and so I can have a little bit of broader view and not be totally certain as to where I'm going next, both artistically or in any other way.
Well, maybe since you write so much about family dynamics, you can be a dad.
Yeah, that's the plan. We'll see how long it takes. But
whatever happens, as one of my favorite characters in your play, The Rest, says, "See you in the future." See you in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you very much. And we were having such an interesting conversation, I asked Hunter if he'd stay to tape a dialogue extra. He agreed, and I encourage you to check out that program by going to our streaming video site. Just go to video.idahoptv.org and click on Dialogue. That's also where you can watch the program and extra I taped with Hunter in 2012. It's certainly been fun to see his success. Thanks for tuning into this edition of Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.